The wind here moves like a memory, thin, cold, carrying salt and the faint rasp of something that used to be alive. It slips between broken columns and the ribs of sunken streets, and when you listen closely the stones answer in a voice that sounds almost human. You stand where the map ends and the story begins. There are places on this planet that refuse to be tidy. They keep their secrets folded into the grain of rock, into the sea that covers them, into language that has crumbled away. No plaque will tell you everything. No museum label can hold the ache these sites carry. No one knows why some structures were built where they were, or how some objects came to be so precise, so impossible. The enigma deepens with each new survey. Imagine a coast where fishermen still throw nets over a shoal and pull up fragments of a city, a column capital, a bronze nail, a slab with a pattern that repeats like a heartbeat. Imagine divers probing with modern sonar and finding avenues under 30 feet of water, yet, on the maps drawn by scribes 300 years ago, this place is a lush plain. Who drew those maps? Who lived here? No one knows the full answer. I've come to these edges for the same reason you will. Because the visible and the invisible intersect, because the past still argues with the present. As a narrator and as a careful interpreter of fragments, I do not claim certainties. I collect textures, dates, survey notes, and local memory. I trace the thin lines between what the stones say and what the living remember. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not a single object or ruin, but the stubborn insistence of the world to keep holding its questions. How did they move these stones? How did they mark their dead? Why are some inscriptions written in a tongue that no living scholar reads without a long list of question marks beside it? When the fog lifts, you can see the place more clearly. Sunlight pours across a courtyard where geometry refuses randomness, circles nested inside rectangles, a spiral of carved stones that focus light at noon. Someone engineered this geometry. Someone planned for ceremonies that aligned with eclipses and stillborn constellations. Perhaps it was a high ritual center. Perhaps it was an observatory. Mainstream scholars suggest practical reasons, astronomical markers for agriculture, or simple prestige architecture, survey records, recent photogrammetry. Fringe ideas suggest lost knowledge, an ancient measurement system erased from the textbooks. The truth sits between those voices, patient as lichen. The air now tastes of metal. There is a small object on a tray in a field lab beside the site, an orb of hammered bronze, pitted with age, polished where hands once held it. It weighs less than a child's fist but tells a heavier story, microstriation that marks mastery, an alloy mixture that betrays trade routes, where patterns that map months of handling. Technicians run a handheld XRF over it. The readout is a scatter of ratios. The lab will later note: alloy composition inconsistent with regional production. Portable XRF, 2021. For now, the orb sits in a foam cradle and looks impossible. If you stood here among the mist and stone, what would you believe? There is a ritual to approaching ruins, slower steps, soft voices, cataloging the small things first, potsherds, an eyebolt, a shard of painted plaster. These fragments are the grammar of a lost language. They tell us about diet, trade, thresholds of wealth, and funerary care. In one coastal site, a team found fish bones in a ceramic sealed jar beside a grave, a detail that rewrites assumptions about what people ate and how they were buried. It's a single grain of evidence that destabilizes a theory. We rely on methods: radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence, photogrammetry, laser scanning. Each technique is a key with its own limitations and slot of uncertainty. Radiocarbon gives us ranges, not exact years. Radiocarbon calibration curves, multiple labs. Laser scans reveal microtopography that eyes miss, tool marks, microgrooves, the exact curvature of a hammer strike. Photogrammetry stitches thousands of images into a 3D skin that can be rotated and dissected in a lab far from the sun. These tools have brought clarity, but they have also generated new puzzles. The more precisely we measure, the stranger the anomalies become. Consider the labyrinth of carved stones found inland, where a village sits above a filled depression. On the surface, the rock looks like a field of pockmarks, natural, but a laser scan survey, 2018, exposed concentric channels, evenly spaced, leading to a central basin. The channels are interspersed with bas-relief faces, no two identical, some half-eroded, some preserved as if time paused its hand. Who carved these faces? In what order? What did the basin catch? Rainwater? Blood? Offerings? The faces gaze outward upon the valley, and the valley, on clear days, reflects the basin's geometry back onto the sky. Local elders call the place by a name that translates as the Suffing Circle, pronounced Soiching. They tell a story of a hollow that sang when the moon swelled. The story is not evidence in a laboratory sense, but it is a truth of lineage, an oral anchor for a landscape's meaning. The intersection between the scientific readout and the local narrative is not a competition but a conversation. Both contribute to the texture of inquiry. What would you leave behind if you believed your work would be read only by ghosts? The most confounding objects are those that point to long-distance exchange before we expected it. A pendant carved from obsidian found in a highland tomb has trace elements that match a volcanic source 400 kilometers away, geochemical sourcing, ICP-MES. The workmanship shows a style from a coastal ceramic tradition. How did artisans thousands of years ago access networks that span mountains and seas? Some propose trade hubs and seasonal migration routes. Others propose pilgrimage networks. What both camps agree on is the human capacity to connect vast territories long before our timelines predict. Sometimes, the remains are not glorious but quietly troubling, rows of graves where age and sex do not match the expected distribution. A cemetery at a river bend yielded adult skeletons with childhood pathologies that indicate malnutrition, yet grave goods matched high-status burials. Osteological analysis, 2016. The social profile of the dead does not sit comfortably with the material markers. Did status change quickly? Were these migrants? Or are our assumptions about status entirely modern lenses? There is a reputation that attends unsolved sites, a romantic, occasionally exploitative aura that attracts treasure hunters and true believers alike. We must be careful. Curiosity can become extraction. The ethical line is where respect begins, permission from local communities, transparent sharing of data, non-destructive sampling when possible. Science without consent is not noble, and archaeology without ethics is theft. This is not to moralize from a distance, it's to note that many of these mysteries remain unsolved because access was denied for decades, or because looting shredded the context. Who has the right to ask the questions? Who gets to take the samples? In a cave whose mouth yawns like a wound, inscriptions run along the ceiling, symbols sliced into soft limestone with a precision that suggests practiced hands. They are not language in any known corpus. They repeat in rhythms that hint at counting or chant. Micro-excavations reveal pigment in crevices, red ochre, traces of carbon black. Thermal imaging shows that some patterns absorb heat differently, implying a mortar or varnish that has survived. Scholars debate whether these signs are symbolic notation, a protoscript, or decorative motifs, inscription analysis ongoing. Nobody offers a consensus. We stand beneath those marks on a rainy day and we whisper the same question: who had the audacity to carve their thoughts into darkness? Not every mystery is monumental. One of the most compelling stories begins with a single, ordinary tool, a wooden handle found with metal fittings, preserved in anoxic mud. Dendrochronology dates the handle to a narrow range of years. The wood species points to a distant upland grove. Tool use and where patterns suggest repeated heavy use, not ritual display. Someone fashioned this tool and used it until it wore thin. It is mundane and exquisite, a human fingerprint across time. To read where an ancient wood is to read a life's labor. There is a temptation to romanticize these objects, to call them relics of lost geniuses. But the archaeological record is composed mostly of small, desperate practicalities. Yet from those small things emerges a staggering architectural imagination. Terraces carved into cliffs, canals diverted to feed cities, monumental stones raised with a choreography of ropes and rollers. How did they coordinate labor across generations? Which solutions were practical, and which were expressions of belief that also solved a logistical problem? One coastal ruin offers a technical puzzle: an offshore platform, rows of dressed stones set into shallow water, matching no harbor on the maps. The platform is perpendicular to prevailing currents, as if designed to break swell for boats mooring on its leeward side. Yet no anchorage was expected here. There is no safe approach from the east without navigating a shoal. Recent sonar mapping, multibeam bathymetry, 2020, shows levels that suggest the platform was built when sea level was lower by several meters. Did rising sea drown a harbor? Did tectonic subsidence alter the coastline? Geoarchaeologists model subsidence events and tsunami risk. But the human story, why someone anchored themselves to this place and built into the water, remains obscure. A thought flares: some builders act not in fear of the sea but in defiance of it. There are inscriptions that refuse translation, not because linguists are lazy but because scripts can be plastic hybrids, borrowing logograms, syllabaries, and local pictographs. A shard with an inscription found in a burial pit shows 3 systems overlapping: one decorative, one administrative, one unknown. The administrative signs tally counts, grain, sheep, while the pictographs depict an animal with a crescent on its flank. The unknown signs sit like secret punctuation. We map them, cluster them, and then step back. The script refuses to yield a neat syntax. Every unsolved object keeps the possibility of being explainable. The gap is not always mystical, it is often procedural. We lack context: a missing pot, a ruined temple, a burned archive. When archives survive, clay tablets, papyrus rolls, carved stele, we translate and connect, and suddenly the world rearranges itself into comprehensible motion. When archives don't survive, we become detectives of light and shadow. For many of these mysteries, the best work happens slowly, season by season, layer by layer. An excavation trench is a story told in cross-section. You strip the topsoil and you are stripping away recent decisions: plowing, reuse, collapse. Underneath these are earlier choices: house floors, hearths, graves. Each stratum is a volume of time. Modern teams photograph every centimeter, label every find, and upload the data to shared repositories, open data portals, 2019 onwards. The democratization of archaeological data has accelerated discovery. Crowds of specialists can examine a dataset and see details missed by the initial team. Yet openness raises new problems: how to manage ownership of interpretations, how to protect sensitive locations from looters. Should a site be open if it invites harm? In a mountain shrine, a carved stone with a hole precisely drilled through its axis sits at the center of a circle. The hole aligns with a mountain peak 12 kilometers away, and on certain days the morning sun threads the aperture, casting a narrow band of light across the inner chamber. An archaeo-astronomical reading suggests ritual alignment with a solstitial event: field observation, archaeoastronomy. Builders engineered a sightline that survives geological shifts and centuries of weather. Such alignments are not mere coincidence. They were choices, polished by hands that folded cosmology into daily life. The deeper the inquiry, the more complicated the human layer becomes. People answered their own problems with solutions that load meaning into material choices. A seawall is both engineering and a boundary of belonging. A burial mask is both a way to honor the dead and an assertion of status. A painted wall preserves an aesthetic and a theological world. Is there a single thread through these mysteries? Perhaps it is the persistence of human imagination against entropy. There are times when the past speaks with noisy directness: a sealed chest, an undisturbed offering beneath a floor, a cache of coins that suddenly rewrites chronology. Those moments reframe entire debates. But more often the past murmurs. We assemble hypotheses, test them, and let them breathe in peer review. We refine methods and sometimes overturn established narratives. That is the slow, patient miracle of archaeology. It teaches us humility. Our models are scaffolding, not monuments. As evening falls and the site manager dims the lights, the stones become silhouettes, mysterious, unyielding, inviting. We return to the field lab, where samples cool in labeled bags and digital models hum in the background. There is satisfaction in cataloging, precise measurements, contextual notes, tentative interpretations. There is also the constant awareness of what is missing, the part of the story that might never be recovered. What will remain after we are gone? When the work is shared, data released, local communities consulted, findings published, our interpretations become part of the public imagination. People will make myths from the data, and myths will in turn feed new questions. Some viewers will argue for simple solutions, others will propose grand conspiracies. Both will be entertained here because mystery invites speculation. My job is to keep that speculation tethered, mark clearly when an idea is a compelling hypothesis and when it is a wish. In these ruins, we find both the mundane and the miraculous. A child's toy carved of bone, a ledger scratched into clay, an engineered basin that captures starlight, each piece a voice in a chorus that refuses to be silenced. My role is not to finish their sentences but to listen and to narrate the listening. Tonight I leave with a handful of photographs, a tray of labeled samples, and the echo of stone under my boots. The real work happens later: analysis, debate, replication. Each step is a slow turning of the key. If you were here with me, which object would you carry home in memory? The orb that hints at trade networks, the basin that aligns with the heavens, the inscription that no one reads? Which mystery would keep you awake? The enigma deepens. The story is patient. And the stones, when the wind dies down, seem to whisper, "Return." You follow the lights back along the flagged path, and the stones at the edge of the excavation seem smaller now, as if their silence has been partially uncovered and is shrinking into the dark. The trench drops away in a ribbon of earth, one measured cut through centuries, and within its strata you can read the slow history of human carelessness and ingenuity. Hearths, packed earth floors, a child's scattering of beads, a collapsed wall where timber once held a roof. No one knows how many lives were folded into that collapse. A single lantern hangs near the lab tent, its flame trembling in the sea breeze. Inside, a thin map is pinned to cork, lines in brown ink that trace canals and roads. Someone has circled a tiny icon and written a shorthand note. Possible quay? Field sketch labeled. That small doubt, possible quay, carries a whole sequence of hypotheses. If a quay existed, then trade routes shift. If trade routes shift, population models must be revised. If population models revise, our story about who settled this coast changes shape. Sometimes an entire chapter of human activity is rewritten by a single find, a stamped seal, a ledger tablet, a scrap of painted plaster with a list of names. These administrative remains are the stubbornly modern thing in ancient contexts. They speak in the cold language of accounts and taxes. They remind us that people organized, planned, and counted. Yet the same hands that tallied grain also carved images of gods, arranged feasts, and buried their dead with toys and broken tools. The bureaucratic and the devotional sit side by side. Remember the amphora, cracked along its belly and patched once, then again, found beneath a collapsed threshold. Its clay bears fingerprints of hands that lived 5 generations apart. It smells faintly, in the lab, like old yeast and salt. Residue analysis reveals traces of fermented fruit and a spice that traveled from a distant island. Residue chromatography, preliminary. A simple storage vessel becomes a narrative of movement and taste across seas. Each chemical trace is a little proof of connection. Who knew a smell could travel millennia? Not all discoveries are gifts. Some are accusations. A cache of human bone removed from a pit within a house tells a different story. Sudden death, hurried burial, faces hidden in blankets. Osteoarchaeology notes perimortem trauma. The pattern hints at violence, an argument with archaeology's polite distance. There are times when a site becomes a crime scene of the distant past. We bring forensic methods to bear because the question is urgent. Was this an outbreak of violence, a targeted purge, a massacre in response to scarcity? The stones will not say who pulled the trigger, but they record the aftermath in the way floors are trampled and doors are sealed. You find yourself asking a question that archaeologists are always asked: are we reconstructing the past, or inventing a version that comforts the present? The answer is both. We reconstruct with evidence and imagination. Evidence constrains, imagination supplies texture. but we must test imagination against the cold ledger of data. That balance is the ethical knot at the heart of fieldwork. Morning comes with gulls and a thin light that makes the carved reliefs look like a script of shadows. A team arrives from the university with a van of instruments, tripods, a crate of lasers, laptops humming with mapping software. They set up control points and begin the patient process of photogrammetry, circling the reliefs and taking overlapping photographs until the software can render exact maps of every chisel mark. The model that emerges on a screen later will allow the team to measure the depth of a groove to fractions of a millimeter. Those measurements will create arguments in journals. They will also let someone across the world run virtual experiments, lighting studies, tool use reconstructions, without disturbing the original stone. The stones, for now, only receive light. There is a kiln not far from the main trench, its rim half buried, its northern face pocked by frost and salt. The kiln's last firing left a layer of ash fused to its bricks, and beneath that ash a scatter of misfired shards. Pottery typology places those shards within a wider ceramic tradition that stretches along the coast. Typology comparison. A cluster of stamps, repeated like an artisan's signature, suggests a workshop system that standardized production. This is not a story of solitary genius but of shared technique and apprenticeship. How did craftsmen learn their trade? How was skill transmitted? Sometimes the answer is obvious: family lines, guilds, apprenticeship. Other times the transmission is invisible: a migrant potter who moved with their clan, a traveling master who taught an island style to a mountain valley. There are traces: a decorative motif identical across distant sites, a kiln technology that leaps over a mountain range. Take the hammerstones discovered on terraces inland, pebbles worn smooth in identical patterns, their use where matching experimental replicates. Tool study connects hands across landscapes. And then there are monuments that refuse to fit the pattern. A carved slab found at a high pass, no comparable style anywhere within 1,000 kilometers, bears an abstract fractal motif, geometric and unsettling. Its execution is technically sophisticated, incisions at microscopic regularity, a repeated motif that looks almost algorithmic. No one has an easy theory. Some say it's local innovation, others suggest a traveling artisan with skills rare in the region. The enigma deepens. We prorate wonder when you label an object innovative. You also open the door for wild conjecture. The better practice is to accumulate correlated data, material composition, weathering patterns, context in the soil, and then build a cautious narrative. On the second week, the survey team brings in a geophysics array and sweeps the plain with ground-penetrating radar. The readout is a banded layer, echoes that become images of buried walls, voids where structures might have stood. The line work surprises the team, a rectilinear grid where previous surveys suggested only scatter. When you overlay this with an old aerial photograph from 30 years ago, you see faint traces where the sun once hit different materials and revealed outlines. Someone saved that photograph in the university archive, and now it becomes crucial. Old data sometimes becomes new evidence. The archive is a reservoir, it is a palimpsest of observation. Do you ever wish you could borrow time from the past? A mid-morning dig reveals a niche in the wall, and inside it rests a wooden tablet, thin planks bound with fiber. Its surface bears scoring, not obvious letters but repeated marks like tally strokes. The wood smells faintly resinous. It was packed in silt and sealed from oxygen. The team calls in conservators who stabilize the tablet with gelatin and gently dry it. Under raking light, the marks clarify into a list of commodities, perhaps grain, oil, salted fish, next to symbols that may denote quantity or owners. Preliminary reading. Administrative life, once again. The economy writes itself in small strokes. You start to sense the architecture of daily life. Storage rooms adjacent to hearths, small courtyards for weaving, drains that channel water from roofs into communal cisterns. When you reconstruct the domestic pattern, you reconstruct how people use their days. That reconstruction is the most human thing archaeology offers, not only grand halls and columns, but the smell of bread and the placement of a child's bowl. In a narrow valley, a series of terraces cling to the hillside like steps to a giant's throne. Each terrace holds a field stone wall, and in the lower terraces you find irrigation channels, tiny engineered canals that distribute water with mathematical precision. A hydrological model suggests these channels fed crops at intervals matching seasonal rainfall. Engineers in the field test the gradients and calculate flow rates. The terraces are both agricultural technology and a social statement: organized labor, communal planning, and landscape transformation. Did the terraces arrive by committee or by charismatic leadership? Both are possible. Large-scale infrastructure often demands someone to coordinate labor and resources. The identity of that coordinator might be a council of elders, a religious elite, or a central authority. The earth doesn't tell who filled the ledger, it records the labor. You walk until your boots are wet with morning dew, and somewhere in the distance a bell rings, not a church bell but a modern alarm marking the end of a scheduled work period. The team gathers for notes, for coffee, for the ritual of comparing observations. Fieldwork is as much conversation as it is excavation. Hypotheses form in the spaces between voices. At midday, a courier arrives with an unexpected box, a fragment of a carved relief sent from a private collection offered for study. The offering is a small act of openness, and also a reminder of how objects circulate beyond controlled contexts. The fragment fits a missing piece from the site's temple front, an elegant solution to a 20-year mystery. The artifact's partial provenance is messy, but its join is geometrically perfect. The return of such pieces raises ethical and legal questions, but also offers the chance to recombine evidence into something whole. We are messy instruments of recovery. A child watches from behind a fence as researchers photograph a mosaic floor newly exposed. Her face is serious. She observes as if counting techniques and colors into memory. Later, you learn she is the granddaughter of a local potter, and she knows the names of motifs better than many of the researchers. Local knowledge sustains the excavation as much as any instrument. It is not enough to bring methods and machines, you must also listen. Community workshops proceed after each day of work. The team shares scans and explains plans. Local voices propose stories that sometimes provide surprising leads. A well that always smells of vinegar, a rock that rings when struck. These unscientific observations are not to be dismissed. Anecdote can guide investigation. Sometimes the human bridge between past and present is literal. A community elder who remembers the site as a playground in childhood points to a buried threshold under a fig tree and says, "My grandmother stopped coming here when the rot started." Oral histories can anchor excavation strategies, pointing to places where older residents remember activity. Those memories are not precise in a chronometric sense, but they are guideposts for where to dig. Archaeology without people is a drained, clinical practice. You begin to see the interplay of disasters and continuity. A layer of charcoal and ash marks a conflagration, an event that redrew the settlement's map. Burn layers tell us about abrupt change, invasion, accidental fire, ritual burning. A burned library, if libraries can be said to exist in portable form, can silence entire histories. In one oxidized stratum, you find calcined tablets, their inscriptions lost to heat. The loss is a wound. It is evidence for violence against memory. Yet the next layer is often a repair, a new hearth, new pottery, a rebuilding that reuses old stones. Human resilience appears not only in monumental reconstruction but in the simple act of setting a new pot on a fresh shelf. Continuity and rupture are twin themes of the archaeological record. There are moments when the past speaks in clarity. In a sealed niche within a temple you uncover a painted panel, pigments preserved under a collapsed roof. The composition is startling in its intimacy, a procession of figures bearing offerings, their garments detailed in a style unknown in nearby sites. Pigment analysis reveals organic binders from plant gums that place the technique within a certain tradition. Pigment analysis, preliminary. The scene suggests a ritual perhaps linked to agricultural cycles. That image becomes an anchor, an aesthetic statement attached to a practice. So much of what we know is visual. Color, pattern, posture, they are the grammar of ancient expression. When motifs repeat across sites, we map influence and exchange. When motifs diverge, we ask why. A variant motif becomes an argument about identity. This is us, not them. By late afternoon, the sky fills with clouds that look like a painted cloth, staged to dramatize the moment. The team pauses to photograph the silhouette of an exposed wall against that sky. A sudden rainstorm arrives and the site scuds under tarpaulins. Water runs into the trenches. The trench edges slump. The team moves quickly to cover sensitive contexts. Weather is a constant collaborator and adversary. Erosion is a slow demolition. Heavy rains can erase a season's careful work. Field season planning is a battle with the calendar and climate. As night falls again, the lab buzzes with the modest triumphs of the day: a successful join between pottery fragments, a laser scan rendered without noise, a small grant application submitted that will fund a season of radiocarbon dates. You pin new photos to the board and step back. The narrative resolves into 1,000 small decisions: what to sample, where to focus, who to consult. Each decision biases the story you will later tell. That awareness is a constant check against the desire for tidy conclusions. What will the future see in our piles of labeled bags? No one can say, yet we record rigorously so that others will have the raw material to challenge and revise our narratives. Archaeology is an argument across generations. We do not hold final verdicts. We publish hypotheses and invite critique. The enigma deepens and sometimes scatters into a chorus of possible truths. In the quiet hours, the site seems to keep its breath. The stones cool. A stray dog pads along the edge, nosing at a discarded glove. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent and steady. Under that sky, the smallest object, a bead, a rusted nail, a curled strip of leather, feels like a direct communication. You cradle it and imagine the hand that once held it, the thumb that rubbed its edge. There is intimacy in that gesture. Across millennia, hands meet through objects. That meeting is the core of why we look. If you could ask one question aloud at the ruins and have the earth answer, what would you ask? The enigma deepens. The field season continues. And we, patient and curious, keep listening. The night wind smells of salt and old paper. It moves across the exposed mosaic like a searching hand, lifting a corner of dust and revealing a painted line beneath. In the morning, light pours across the tesserae and every color sings: lapis that still holds a slow, deep blue, a yellow that glows as if it were sunlight trapped centuries ago. The mosaic scene is domestic and strange: a table laid with fish and figs, a procession of small figures bearing offerings, and at the edge a single animal unlike any in the local bestiary. Who sketched that animal into the square? Who decided it belonged with those dishes and that assembly? Excavation is a conversation with absence. The moment you clear soil, you are simultaneously creating a new context for what remains. A pattern emerges. People reused spaces until they couldn't, and then sometimes they sealed the old with reverence, sometimes with haste. In a tomb just beyond the trench, a lid sits crooked, its inscription eroded but legible enough to read a name that recurs in other documents from the region. The name ties families together across generations. It is a slender thread, but it is real. Genealogies are reconstructed from pottery, from burial orientation, from isotopic traces of childhood diets, little records that stitch lives into longer narratives. A gust lifts a tarp and sends a scatter of notes across the camp. The project's director laughs, breath white in the air, and gathers the papers like a careful gardener collecting seeds. Field notebooks are treasures: marginal sketches, hurried measurements, a note that says simply, "Possible foundation line?" These small hesitations are why later teams must recheck every meter of the trench. Archaeology privileges second looks. You find a coin, tiny, verdigris modeled, hammered thin, with an image of a ruler whose portrait does not match any local catalog. Its presence in a domestic fill suggests exchange, movement, and perhaps a far-flung political connection. Coins anchor chronology with a blunt certainty unmatched by stylistic guesswork. Yet even coins can lie when their circulation is complex. Still, this small metal disc becomes a hinge in the argument. Trade reached here sooner than we planned for. How did that reshuffle the social map? At the edge of camp, a conservator works under a portable lamp, coaxing a painted wooden figurine from a block of compacted sediment. Its face is worn smooth. A small hole at the base suggests it once fit onto a peg, perhaps part of a larger tableau. When the conservator brushes away scale and silt, the pigment reveals a startling palette, emeralds and ochres layered with a finesse that implies practiced hands and access to pigments that traveled long distances. The figurine will later be analyzed for binder composition. For now, it is a miracle of small scale. It speaks not of empire but of intimate devotion. Who held that figurine? Who whispered to it? By midweek, the geophysical team announces a new anomaly, a linear depression that runs like a hidden script beneath a field of pasture. The radar returns suggest a series of post holes, repeating holes at regular intervals that could mark an avenue, a stockade, or a processional way. The team debates: a defensive palisade, or ceremonial delineation? Options cascade into social models. Was the community under threat, or were they declaring a sacred boundary? Both explanations reshape the imagination of the place. You learn to love the small contradictions. A household with imported wares and a hearth that shows evidence of poor nutrition, a temple with minimal offerings and a wealthy adjoining house, a child's burial with an adult's wealth. These anomalies force you to interrogate assumptions. That wealth equaled power, that access to goods equaled status. Human societies are messy, and archaeology must reflect that messiness rather than sanitize it. On a recent afternoon, a visiting linguist whispers over a string of marks on pottery, quick strokes that may be names or simple ownership marks. She arranges them like puzzle pieces and suggests a reading that would relocate trade corridors eastward by centuries. The team falls into a hush. A single interpretive shift can alter regional narratives. The weight of that potential change settles in your chest. You check the stratigraphy, you re-examine the forming layer, you call for more samples. What is the cost of one reinterpretation? How many textbooks will need revision? The longest evenings are for lab work. Under fluorescent lights, the minute world of residues opens like a secret. Chemical profiles reveal plant fats and residues that tell of recipes, combinations of oil, spice, and fermented grain. A jar once dismissed as ordinary becomes a map of taste. Taste is a social technology. Preferences travel with traders, with itinerant cooks, with conquering armies. When the residue chemistry aligns with a distinct botanical signature traced to a distant island, the web of interaction becomes visible on a culinary level. Food becomes evidence of connection. Not all evidence is chemical. Sometimes the most persuasive data comes from wear-pattern studies, how a stone's surface is abraded by ropes, the micro-chippings of a mortar face where a quarryman's tool slipped, the polish on a threshold worn by generations of feet. These microscopic signatures are the handwriting of labor. They reveal repetition, specialization, and craft intensity. From the angle of a chisel strike you infer not only technique but the probable tool and perhaps the workshop that produced it. There is a night when lightning cracks across the sky and the camp generators falter. In the sudden dark, the team gathers like sailors around a dim lamp, sharing food and theory by lamplight. In that circle, stories circulate, oral histories told by the local elder who remembers when his father found a curious stone that hummed when struck. He brings a memory to the project, a place on the far slope where the bedrock rings like a bell. The team marks the slope for survey. Memory becomes method. We are not merely catalogers of technique, we are inheritors of curiosity. The field season brings visitors, journalists, graduate students, a donor whose family once funded early explorations in the region. Their questions are different. Some ask about sensational possibilities, others about preservation. You field interviews in cautious tones, clarifying what is known and what remains speculative. Public engagement is part of modern archaeology. It is a responsibility to communicate complexity without diluting nuance. Sensational headlines sell, but they can also mislead. We choose transparency. In a narrow chamber under a collapsed aisle, you find a small lacquered box sealed with a resin that modern chemistry will later identify as pine tar mixed with plant oil. Inside are 3 beads, glass, but glass whose composition matches neither local production nor well-known import recipes. They are enigmatic in color and method, a hybrid technique that suggests an artisan experimenting with materials. The beads are personal, likely part of a necklace or garment. They will become an intimate focal point for a chapter on mobility and personal adornment, how people presented themselves and what those presentations signaled to outsiders. How did aesthetics cross borders? Through marriage, adoption, tribute, theft? Each bead asks small, specific questions. A week later, drones capture aerial imagery that reveals a larger pattern. Field walls aligning to an orientation not toward the nearest river but toward a distant mountain that hosts a named shrine. The Eye of the Hill. Local, Chashmiku, pronounced Chashma Akeo. The shrine's name stirs a legend. On full moon nights it reflects back a light from a mirror said to be buried with a sacred object. Whether the mirror exists isn't proven, but the alignment of walls toward that mountain suggests that landscape held ritual gravity. People oriented their lives around places that mattered to them. Ritual and agriculture overlapped. When you overlay the newly discovered grid with historical rainfall models, a pattern emerges. The agricultural system thrived during a wetter phase and then staggered as rainfall decreased. Climate appears as a slow actor in the story, not a villain but a factor that reshaped human coping strategies. Terraces were repaired, storage capacity increased. Dietary signatures shift toward more drought-tolerant crops. Resilience is visible in stone. You are often asked, in interviews and at public talks, whether archaeology offers answers or only more questions. The honest reply is that it offers patterns, evidence-laden suggestions that narrow possibilities. Each season knocks the improbable from the table and clarifies where certainty might lie. The method is iterative. The archive grows, interpretations refine. On the last day before a scheduled hiatus, the team opens a sealed context beneath a collapsed wall and finds something both small and catastrophic to previous timelines, an inscribed shard that aligns with a calendar system thought to arrive later. The shard's inscription, brief, economical, a single date mark, implies administrative complexity and suggests an earlier adoption of calendrical reckoning. The air in camp changes, conversations speed up. Radiocarbon samples are prioritized, requests for funding escalate. The shard will likely reshape regional chronology. It is a small thing that redrafts time. What will be redrawn when these dates are published? Packing up is a ritual of compression. Tarps fold, trenches are recovered, notes are digitized and backed up to cloud servers with multiple redundancies. The park authorities and local community receive copies of reports and datasets. Collaboration is not a buzzword here. It is the only practical way to ensure the site's future. Heritage is a public good. You leave the trench with the sensation of a story paused mid-breath. The objects taken to labs will yield data in months, fast enough for grant cycles but slow in the human heart. This is the tempo of archaeology, patience punctuated by small, thrilling ruptures. If you could press your ear to the earth and listen to the slow heartbeat beneath the trenches, what rhythms would you hear? The enigma deepens, and the search continues. Dawn threads itself through the tarps, and the camp wakes like a slow animal. Boots, murmured plans, the hiss of coffee. A fainter, older rhythm pulses beneath that bustle. The measured tapping of tools, the careful scraping that reveals an old floor, the tiny rain of soil into buckets. In a sheltered trench, a cluster of bones sits in articulation, ribs splayed as if the person had rolled on their side. A bead still loops at the wrist. The sight is intimate and immediate. Who wrapped that body? Who counted the beads, and what promises were whispered beside that burial? These are the human details that make chronology feel alive. You walk the line where the new survey meets the old map and notice something almost comical, a cartographer's error, a misplaced river bend, yet that error shaped lives. Roads diverted, fields claimed, households built with a different horizon in mind. Mistakes in maps are also historical facts. They tell us about perception and power, who drew the map, who it served, and what agendas bent its lines. A new lead comes from an unexpected place, a schoolteacher from a nearby village who remembers her grandmother singing a lullaby that includes the name of a place now under scrub. She hums the melody for the team, and the archaeologist's lips move as if translating rhythm into coordinates. Oral tradition often contains embedded coordinates, names, repeated descriptors, references to topography, that when mapped carefully can point to features lost to aerial surveys. We treat these memories like clues, not gospel, but they are often startlingly precise. What if memory is an archive of its own, underutilized yet rich? In a narrow chamber cut into bedrock, the team uncovers a ring of stones carved to accept wooden posts. The impressions remain as charcoal stains and post molds. Around the ring lie shards painted with a spiral motif, concentric circles nested within circles. The motif repeats across the site, on a lintel, on a pot rim, on a child's toy. It becomes a visual leitmotif, a sigil that appears in contexts of ritual and of daily life alike. Why would the same sign appear on a cooking vessel and on a sanctuary threshold? Symbols cross boundaries. They are both emblems and tools. A visiting metallurgist holds up a small bronze fitting under a magnifier and points out a granularity that suggests cold hammering followed by localized annealing. The work shows journeyman's skill, not an amateur's clumsy stroke. Such technical signatures let us peer into workshops and identify possible itinerant craft traditions, hands moving across landscapes leaving a pattern of techniques like fingerprints. In the hands of specialists, objects become maps of human movement. By late afternoon, a new evening note arrives, a peat sample from a nearby bog that may contain pollen capable of refining the environmental sequence. Pollen analysis is slow, but it is patient work that gives voice to vegetation history. What fields grew, what trees were cleared, when grasses encroached on terraces. These micro-records of climate and landscape shift give texture to social models. They tell us why a crop choice might have made sense in a given century. Correlating human decisions with environmental pressures brings nuance to stories usually told as simple tales of conquest or collapse. You begin to see how interdisciplinary archaeology is: botanists, geophysicists, osteologists, linguists, each a translator of a fragment. The archive assembled is more like an orchestra than a soloist. Each specialist brings an instrument, and together they begin to play something comprehensible. Night falls and the team convenes to compare notes. A junior researcher lays out a hypothesis that would knit a dozen anomalies into a single narrative, a maritime corridor that functions seasonally, shifting with monsoons, carrying not only goods but ideas and ritual forms. The suggestion is elegant because it explains distribution patterns across islands and highlands, and it is plausible because of the chemical signatures on pottery and the orientation of port structures. Elegant hypotheses are seductive and must be tested rigorously. Seduction is not proof. What happens when an elegant narrative meets stubborn data? The next trench opens onto something surprising: a sealed floor preserved under collapse, and beneath that, a wooden box. Preservation of organics is rare and then precious. The conservators arrive with gloved hands and soft tools. The box contains folded textiles, brittle but patterned, and a string of tiny shells carefully bound together. The stitching technique on the textile is unlike any regional example. The weave matches a style recorded centuries later in a culture to the east. The temporal mismatch stuns the team. Either the weave was transmitted far earlier than assumed, or we have misread the context. Both prospects demand humility and renewed sampling. When textiles speak, they often whisper about networks of exchange. Cloth travels with people, as dowries, as tribute, as plunder. The weave binds bodies to economies. A long, low rain begins and the site transforms. Dust becomes clay, colors deepen, the trenches gleam like cut stone. Rain forces a change in pace, work slows, hypotheses steepen into reflection, and lab techs take to cataloging instead of digging. The weather becomes part of the narrative, shaping what can be known within a season. In that pause, the team revisits old photos and notes, drawing lines between a dozen scattered clues, a motif repeated across pottery, a post-hole alignment that mirrors a celestial sideline, a bead type that only appears where specific trade winds could reach. Patterns congeal into plausible routes. Sometimes, the work leads to moral reckonings. A cache of human remains, when examined, shows signs of surgical intervention, skull trephination, and incision healed in life. This evidence introduces a humane complexity. People practiced medical procedures, perhaps with spiritual framing, perhaps as pragmatic attempts to relieve pain. The presence of such interventions forces the narrative away from simple labels of primitive or advanced and toward an appreciation of localized medical knowledge. Who treated whom, and why? Was medical practice linked to social status, or was it a common communal skill? On a clear morning, drones pick up a linear crop mark that cuts across the region like a faint scar. Following it leads to a buried causeway, an engineered road raised slightly above floodplain that links two sites once thought unrelated. The causeway reorients the map. Now settlements align along a deliberate axis, implying coordinated planning or long-term control. Roads are political devices. They move goods and armies, but they also move ideas and priests, migrating ceremonies from one sanctuary to the next. The causeway is a claim on the landscape. Maps redraw themselves in surprising ways when a single new line appears. As the season moves toward its midpoint, the team prepares for a risky operation, sampling a deep, waterlogged pit that may contain preserved seeds and insect remains, offering snapshots of past harvests and pests. The pit's anaerobic environment is fragile. Its sampling requires a conservator's patience and immediate cold storage. If successful, the microfaunal and botanical assemblage could reveal crop choices lost from macroanalysis, such as whether millet or barley was dominant, and whether pest outbreaks coincided with changes in storage. These small commercial details often steer grand narratives about resilience and collapse. It is in these tiny economies, the choice of seed, the way grain is stored, that daily survival is decided. In the evenings, when the camp quiets, conversations drift to larger themes. A visiting philosopher asks whether there is a danger in collecting too many answers, whether a complete account might flatten the poetic mystery that draws people to ruins. The team laughs, then admits the tension. Science seeks closure. Myth thrives on openness. Perhaps the best work preserves both, rigorous data alongside a cultivated sense of wonder. Both are human pursuits, complementary, sometimes in tension. What do you prefer, the tidy answer or the lingering question? Towards the end of the week, a tiny discovery arrives like a punctuation mark, a child's footprint in a sealed floor, a heel, toes splayed, as fresh in its preservation as if the child stepped from centuries past into clay and never left. The print is private and astonishing. It gives the site a face, an index of the small, everyday person whose life we otherwise reconstruct from the detritus of labor. That footprint becomes the heart of the camp's public talk that week. It humanizes every statistic and carbon date. People in the village come to view the print, and the children of the community place wreaths of local flowers beside the trench in a spontaneous, tender ritual. These moments remind you why the work matters, not for headlines or tenure, but for the living ties that are renewed between past and present. As you close the trench for the day, the sigil of concentric circles appears again, etched on a shard, painted in a faded band, carved shallowly on a stone lintel. The circle returns like a refrain, a motif that might be decorative, cosmological, or merely the footprint of a favored artisan. You cannot yet tell. But you note it, and you wonder whether, across seasons and workshops, the sign evolved, persisted, and gathered meanings like layers of varnish. No one knows its full import, but its repetition is a map in itself. You leave to the sound of the generator's low hum, and the village dogs calling to the night. The archive grows heavier with each labeled bag. Hypotheses have multiplied. The modest triumphs and the stubborn puzzles both remain. The enigma deepens, as it always will, and the field season folds into reports, into grant proposals, into conferences where these tentative stories will be debated and sharpened. Yet in the quiet that follows, the circle motif spins in your imagination, a small, persistent question beckoning you to return. The circle motif keeps turning in your mind like a coin in a palm, its edges worn, its face inscrutable. At dawn the trench smells of iron and tea, the air is thin and bright with the promise of new revelation. You descend into a newly exposed corridor, a narrow cut carved into bedrock, its walls smoothed by hands that loved the act of shaping stone. Torchlight catches faint tool marks that run parallel, then break into irregularity where the builder adjusted sidelines. The corridor ends at a low doorstone, half buried, sealed with a plaster that shows hairline cracks like dried skin. When conservators tap it, The sound is dull and promising, a hollow note that suggests chamber beyond. The chamber, when opened, does not roar with grandeur. It is intimate, a small room, no larger than a modest house, with a single raised platform against one wall. On the platform lie objects laid in what looks like careful disorder: pots, a braided cord, a dented mirror of polished bronze, and at the very center a bowl filled with fine ash. The ash is layered like sedimentary history, each thin band a different shade, perhaps the residue of repeated tiny rituals. The arrangement implies a practice that was both personal and persistent: a family altar, a craftsman's votive nook, a specialist's workspace. You cannot tell yet. Who tended this niche, and why did they seal it? Under magnification, the rim of the bowl bears a faint incised motif, the same concentric circles you have been tracing across the site. A chill runs through you, not because of superstition, but because motifs are the archaeology of thought. They are the shorthand of values, the logos of belonging. To find the symbol in a small, private space suggests that it was not merely public propaganda but threaded into domestic life. This sigil belonged to the night as much as to the procession. Field notes later will mark the chamber as a key context. Samples will be sent for micromorphology to read the ash layers and for AMS radiocarbon to narrow the bowl's last use. For now, in the hush beneath tarpaulins, the team photographs the bowl, draws its profile, and traces the ash bands with soft brushes. The motion is reverent. Outside, a child follows you, hands clasped, watching how adults work. She asks in small, direct language what the ash is for. You tell her the truth: we do not always know. Sometimes the answer is methodical and slow: lab tests, comparative analysis, patient cross-referencing. Sometimes the answer is never precise. The child frowns, then smiles. Curiosity insists on being comfortable with its own lack of certainty. That small exchange is part of the work's civic value, engagement that teaches patience. The pottery in the chamber includes a cup with a slip that, under transmitted light, reveals a thread of mica, a deliberate inclusion that gives the vessel a subtle sparkle. Material choices like mica are either accidental nor purely aesthetic. They indicate trade in raw materials, choices in kiln recipes, preferences that are culturally coded. A petrographic thin section will show the clay's temper and inclusion profile, and that analysis will anchor the cup in a broader technocomplex. For now, the cup sits like a personal artifact, catching a slant of light and throwing it back as testimony. You step back and consider the architecture that houses this room, a nested plan of small compartments opening into a central yard. The layout suggests a multifamily compound or a workshop complex. Floors show different phases, earlier beaten earth surfaces overlain by stone flags. Doors were moved, thresholds raised. The site is palimpsest. It is the sum of generations rearranging their footprints. The architecture records negotiation, over space, over lineage, over memory. In the lab later that evening, residue analysts will in portable gas chromatographs and begin gentle extraction. The instruments hum, producing graphs that at first glance are indecipherable arrays of peaks. An experienced analyst recognizes botanical markers, traces of linseed oil and a resin that points to a known trade route for aromatic substances, preliminary residue profile. The combination suggests either a crafting process that used these substances, varnishing, preservation, or a ritual use, perhaps libations. Interpretation will require cross-checking with ethnography and pollen analysis from the ash layers. The work is slow, and the deliberation is a discipline. Outside the lab, an argument quietly ignites about provenance. A visiting collector offers archival photographs that include a fragment later identified as part of the same assemblage. The collector's files are helpful, but their chain of custody is imperfect. The ethical debate is immediate: how to use privately held information without legitimizing questionable acquisition. The team decides to document and anonymize the metadata until provenance can be corroborated. Archaeology is not just the study of things, it is the governance of trust. When the sky clears, you climb a ridge to watch the sunset spill down the valley and paint the terraces gold. In the distances, the pattern of fields and causeways becomes legible in a way it was not at ground level. an argument in stone that asserts planning and persistence. That vantage point, a simple human act of stepping back, yields a perspective shift. What looked like scatter is a field, and what looked like isolated habitations is a network. The landscape reads like a palimpsest of collective projects. At dusk, the team hosts a community meeting. You sit in a circle with elders, schoolteachers, and youth, and the translators move like bridges between languages. The elders tell more stories, some airy, some specific, about a time when the plain was said to be full of water, and when certain stones were markers for seasonal grazing. Youth ask blunt questions about tourism and whether the site could support a study center. You listen and record. These conversations are not ceremonial veneers, they are governance in practice. The decisions the community makes will shape conservation strategies and access. Archaeology without local governance is an extraction, not a collaboration. Late that night, insomnia carries you to the tent where the maps hang like constellations. Lines connect points, pottery types, post-hole alignments, pollen dates. You draw a tentative route on tracing paper, a maritime corridor that threads this valley into a wider web of exchange. The model is pleasing because it explains many anomalies: imported beads, exotic pigments, a copper alloy whose composition matches a far coast. Yet you also know the seduction of a neat map. You set the tracing aside and plan another season of testing. What will the new season confirm, and what will it overturn? Sleep arrives in small fits. Dreams are of circles, nested like bowls, echoing the motif in the sealed chamber. You wake with a sense of continuing, of a conversation that pauses and resumes like breath. The work is cumulative. It is a relay across hands and disciplines. Each season adds a note to a composition that is never wholly finished. In the morning, a courier brings a small, weathered envelope with a note from a distant lab. Preliminary isotopic readings on tooth enamels suggest childhood migration for several individuals in the cemetery. The data complicates social models that assumed sedentary communities. People moved, perhaps seasonally or as part of trade, marriage, or forced displacement. Mobility appears as a persistent theme, not upheaval alone but a spectrum of movements that knit landscapes together. You trace those movements on a map, and the lines between childhood and adulthood are not straight. They curve, intersect, and overlay. Lives are not confined to single coordinates. Habitual movement transforms how we think about belonging. That afternoon, as you catalog finds, you notice an inked graffiti on the inner face of a storage jar, an accidental mark that looks like a hurried notation. The scribble is a kind of informal ledger. It may name an owner, a quantity, a date. In that scrawl you find intimacy. The hand that scrawled it was pragmatic, unceremonious, human. The smallness of the gesture is a kind of honesty. If you were to sum up the season with a single sentence, it might simply be: people made choices with the materials and knowledge they had, and those choices accumulated into structures, of stone, of ritual, of economy, that ripple across time. The sigil keeps revolving in your mind. You do not yet know whether it is a brand of identity, a maker's mark, a religious sign, or all of these at once. That uncertainty is not a failure, it is the engine of inquiry. You close the field journals, label the last sample, and file the day's photos. The archive breathes, data waits. Tomorrow, the lab will call with more results. For now, in the dark, you step outside and the stars burn clear. The valley holds its secrets in layers, patient and stubborn. You listen, and you plan to return. The dusk unfolds like a last page being turned, soft, inevitable, and strangely consoling. You walk the terraces once more, each step tracing decisions made by hands that anticipated tomorrow in the only language they had: stone, soil, and stitch. The sigil, those concentric circles, appears again and again, sometimes obvious, sometimes hiding in a smear of pigment or the curl of a handle. It has been a compass and a riddle, a brand and an echo. By now you no longer expect a single answer. You expect a chorus of small truths that, together, feel like meaning. In the small chamber with its bowl of layered ash, the radiocarbon returns with ranges that surprise and also settle like rain on parched soil. The dates do not hand you certainty so much as a new map of probabilities, overlaps and gaps that suggest the ritual was practiced intermittently, perhaps intensified in times of stress, diminished in times of plenty. The ash itself contains pollen of a plant used in preservation rites and traces of resins that came from a distant shore. The material record points outward as often as inward, ritual bound with trade, devotion tied to movement. That intersection becomes the story's spine. Why do humans bind meaning to objects and repeat signs across generations? Perhaps because symbols make continuity possible. A mark on a pot says, "We belong to a lineage of making." A groove on a slab says, "We saw the same sky." A child's footprint says, "Someone lived here long enough to forget not to leave their mark." Each repetition is an act of remembering, and remembering is how communities survive beyond individual lives. At the excavation's edge, the community meets in a circle to decide what will happen next. They talk about a study center, about training programs for youth, about controlled access and local custodianship. The archaeologists bring scanners and reports. The elders bring stories and a sense of stewardship measured in generations rather than grant cycles. The conversation is less about possession and more about conversation, how the past might nourish a living present without being torn apart for spectacle. It is slow work, this negotiation of values, and in it you see a form of continuity as radical as any monument. What does stewardship mean when the soil keeps secrets that the world wants? It means caretaking with consent, it means teaching, it means resisting spectacle. It means understanding that the story told by stratigraphy and the story held in an old woman's lullaby are both valid threads in the same cloth. We do not have to choose between rigor and reverence, we practice both. The lab yields its small miracles in the ensuing months. Isotopic signatures sketch migration pathways on maps that once seemed static. Petrography links a pottery temper to a clay source 100 kilometers away. Residue chemistry evokes meals and medicines and aromatic practices. Each method is a different way of listening. Some hear the hum of trade, others the cadence of craft, others the cadence of diet. Together they compose a more humane picture. People who negotiated risk, who loved small things, who performed rituals that stitched them to each other and to seasons. And still the sigil keeps its ambiguity. In some contexts it is clearly a maker's mark, repeated on pots from the same workshop. In others it is a household emblem, painted on door lintels and etched into spindle whorls. Occasionally it appears where status is on display, cut into stone in a public threshold. The pattern suggests layering of meaning. A symbol that begins in a workshop can migrate into ritual. A household brand can become a public emblem. Meaning is not static. It is migratory, adaptive, and social. You think of the artisans whose hands left those concentric grooves, hands you will never see, but whose gestures your tools can still measure. You think of the child whose print you catalogued, of the elder who hummed a forgotten song, of the conservator who coaxed color from a wooden panel with infinite patience. These are the threads that tie the present to the past, not grand histories alone but intimate acts of maintenance and continuity. There are moments when the narrative must confront its own limits. A sealed library of clay tablets, once thought a possibility, remains stubbornly absent. A hope for inscription that would explain the sigil simply does not exist. The silence is a form of evidence. It teaches that absence is a variable, too, not merely lack but a context that must be explained. Perhaps records were deliberately destroyed in conflagration. Perhaps they decayed in climate that eats papyrus and wood. Perhaps they were never made. The absence forces humility. Sometimes the archive is smaller than our curiosity. At conferences and in peer-reviewed pages, debate will sharpen the story. Some scholars will emphasize trade corridors illuminated by chemical signatures. Others will stress local innovation visible in tool marks and kiln recipes. A few will propose provocative, poorly evidenced theories that make for headlines. Most will patiently test and temper claims. That is the discipline's safeguard, not mystery for its own sake but the steady work of testing. The enigma deepens, and at the same time it yields, slowly and stubbornly, to method. You write a paper that ties the concentric motif to a network of shared designs across valleys, to a seasonal axis of pilgrimage still remembered in folk rites. The paper is careful and speculative where it must be, it invites replication. It is read by a potter in the adjacent country who recognizes a stitch in the documented weave and sends a photograph, her grandmother's loom pattern. The correspondence becomes a small human moment of reconnection across time and distance. Someone on the editorial board calls it bridging archaeology with living tradition, which is true and also insufficient, because what matters is not the accolade but the renewed conversation between people who make and people who study making. How do you close a story about things that never close? You do not close it, you resolve tensions enough to carry the purpose forward. In the following year, a community-run interpretive trail opens, designed with local teachers and youth. It does not reveal every sensitive location, it explains process more than spectacle. Visitors learn how residue analysis tells of taste, how pottery stamps hint at workshops, how a concentric sign can be domestic, public, and sacred all at once. The site becomes a place of learning rather than consumption. That outcome is quieter than viral fame, but it is deeper. The final excavation season, the one whose reports will anchor many future arguments, ends not with a dramatic unearthing but with a small, intimate closure, the careful reburial of a child's footprint under a protective slab, accompanied by wreaths from the village's children. It is a ritual of respect both ancient and modern, a recognition that some parts of the past are for stewardship, not for display. When you walk away from the site for the last time that season, the valley is the same and different. Terraces that were once plowed show delicate lines of new growth. A fig tree now shaded the panels pinned on the lab wall. Local youth who assisted with surveys are now teaching younger children how to record a context. The work has changed relationships and, in small ways, futures. There is one last thing you carry, not a fragment, but a story. It begins with a motif, simple concentric circles, but it becomes the story of people who arranged their lives around land and season, who exchanged goods and ideas, who tended the small domestic altars as carefully as they raised public stone. It is a story about labor and care, about networks and solitude, about continuity and rupture. It is a story that refuses to turn the past into a single explanation, it insists on plurality. If you stand now at the ridge and look down at the stitched landscape, walls, causeways, temples, thresholds, you can read both human intention and the quiet hand of time. The sigil remains, a recurring loop like the breath of a place that has known many hands. The enigma has not been solved completely. That was never the aim. The aim was to listen better, to build bridges between disciplines and communities, to steward rather than plunder, to tell a story anchored in evidence and full of wonder. Perhaps the greatest gift archaeology offers is to expand the time of empathy, to let us imagine, for a moment, the slow arithmetic of a life lived in seasons, the small choices that accumulate into a house, a shrine, a burial, a motif. Those accumulations are what outlast us, not simply monuments, but patterns of making and remembering. You fold the maps, pack the scanners, and leave last season's tarpaulins to be taken down by the team who will stay behind to maintain the site. The valley holds its breath and then exhales in the wind that has always sorted dust into patterns and whispers into earshot. The stones will wait and the sigil will persist in its many guises. New hands will measure its grooves, new questions will arrive. That is the point. History is not a closed book but a continuing conversation. If you had to speak to the people who lived here long ago, what would you say? Perhaps you would only thank them for their handiwork, for their unintentional lesson in endurance, for the exquisite, patient ambiguity they have left behind. And perhaps they would answer with the language of their marks. The circle turned again, not as an end but as an invitation. The enigma deepens, and so does the care we bring to it.